This is my proud privilege to be moderating this lecture by Jean-Luc Racine. And I think that even though we are nearing the end of this wonderful, very hectic, very invigorating literature festival, and the pace is picking up, and I think there may be an element of fatigue out there. But I think this is a very important lecture for us, particularly because we are passing through a very critical phase in a political and social sense. And Jean-Luc Racine, he was anxious that I do not go into a long introduction. But let me just tell you that he is the most prominent expert on South Asia in France.
No.
And that is an important thing because we are very familiar with what the South Asian experts who come from the United States and who mostly work for think tanks in the United States, we are familiar with their views, we sort of read their articles quite regularly. We are also familiar with commentators on this region who come from Britain. But I think it will be very interesting for us to listen to somebody who comes from a different, slightly different perspective and the continental point of view on what is happening in this region. Mr. Racine has been doing field studies in India, mostly in South India. He has spent some time in this region. He was in Calcutta for some years, and he teaches at the Center of South Asian Studies in Paris, and geopolitics is his main area of interest. And he had also co-edited a book on Pakistan, which was published by OUP in 2002. It was in fact proceedings of a seminar that was held in Paris in June 1998, just after we had our atomic explosions. And it was at that time it became very relevant to be talking about Pakistan and to be looking at Pakistan. The subject of his lecture is Images of Pakistan in the New Asian Chessboard, Geopolitics and Literature. And let me then invite Mr. Racine to give his lecture. And would you like to be sitting here?
Yeah, I would prefer.
Rather than go.
If it's not a problem.
So, please.
Thank you very much indeed. I have to thank, of course, Amina Said for giving the green signal for having me here. I have to thank the Alliance Française who took care of my travel. And I have to thank Ghazi Salahuddin for accepting to be the moderator of someone unknown in a festival where so many luminaries are sitting at the mic. And I must say that I have much respect for what you write, or at least for what you write in English, because unfortunately I'm not able to follow what you might write in Urdu. Of course, it's a matter of privilege to be there. For someone who is trying to understand Pakistan, without, I must say so, in full fairness, without having lived in Pakistan as I have lived in India for a long number of years in various stays. But the link has been always maintained since now, what, perhaps 15 years or so, 98, more than that now, or less than that, I don't know. I'm not good at arithmetics. It's really a privilege to attend the second literary festival in Karachi. but perhaps it's an undue privilege to sit here. Because unfortunately, if I'm a scholar, I'm not a writer, I'm not a short storyteller, and to put it frankly, if I had not a strong sense of duty, I would have vacated my seat for going to listen to a conversation with Daniel Mounioudine, or perhaps attending the panel discussion of Bridging Divides, because Bridging Divides, it's something which is dear to me. For someone trained for long in India, crossing the line, not necessarily the line of control, but crossing the line for working in Pakistan or on Pakistan was really a very fun experience. This being said, I don't believe that I should have just confined myself to what's really my field, which is South Asia geopolitics. But of course, venturing to the literature field from where I'm standing is a bit perhaps excessively confident. But maybe I can do it, because after all, during this festival, there was a panel on literature at the age of extremism. And after all, even if this morning in the panel on writing the world, a speaker, Anjan Kampman, I believe, was in a way rightly saying that people, and Western people particularly, tend to put too much politics in literature. But I beg to disagree partly only, because if you forget politics, politics is not forgetting you. And furthermore, it may be fit to quote here Hari Kunzru in his introduction to the art portfolio, which has been published at the middle of a recent issue of Granta magazine on Pakistan. And Kunzru was just saying that whether Pakistani artists like it or not, the question of their identity now has geopolitical significance. And I beg that it's true also for writers. Of course, I'm well aware of my limitation. The authors I shall refer to are mostly writing in English, even if I shall go beyond the confine of English, but only a little because of my limited capacities. But on the other hand, I would like to end my talk on due time by dealing with the issue of translation, which I believe it's also a geopolitical issue. So you might wonder, what's my definition of geopolitics? It's not just international relation, it's not just Indo-Pak relation, it's not just AFPAC as defined by the Obama administration. It's much more than that. And the image that is built up by the readers or by the critics of Pakistani writers who are now starting to be known abroad, including outside the pale of English-speaking country. And here we come back to the question of translation. As long as they modify up to a point the standard image of Pakistan, it's also geopolitics, because geopolitics is not just a question of the hard realist against the hard realist, it's also a question of representation, a question of how you see the other or how you don't want to see the other. And this definition being given, I can perhaps go a step further. I was attending this morning, or it was rather yesterday afternoon. There was a session with a poetry reading where, amongst other, Zeraniga was reciting poems. And for me, without understanding what she was saying, I remember there was a kind of flash. When I was heading the Alliance Française in Calcutta in the late 70s, I organized I don't organize, the people themselves organized, they were using the place, but poetry evening in Bengali. And there was no difference between what I've heard yesterday, the way poetry was expressed, the way the audience was reacting. It could have been Calcutta 30 years ago and not Urdu, but Bengali. Is this a geopolitical statement about the relationship between India and Pakistan? Well, it's up to you to decide. Now, being a scholar and not an expert on literature, I would like just to say a few words about the correlation between the two. As mentioned above, I've been trained as a geographer, by the way, in South India, in Tamil Nadu. But beyond Tamil Nadu, I was working on village life, small towns, and all this kind of thing, really starting from the ground. And for understanding what was a small town in my Tamil district, I could have, of course, turned to reports on urban change, and I did so. But the most profitable reading was the fictional Malgudi town in R.K. Narayanan novels. And not that I wish to oppose, of course, scholarship and literature, but certainly Greek literature, because here we are not talking about fiction, we are talking about literature, which means that I prefer to read, even if I've not yet read, Basharat Peer about what he has to say on the line of control in Kashmir, than to read one of the Tom Clancy book Factory, including one what? It's not a novel, it's a writing under the title Line of Control. And in fact, he's not himself the author, but it's really a book factory. The name of Tom Clancy is in big, and the real name of the author is forgotten in small piece. So I'm not talking about geopolitical novels. I'm talking about literature and its correlation eventually with geopolitics. Why great literature is important? It's important because it brings us a step further. Because there is a power of evocation which can use ambiguity whenever needed, and it helps to convey what is subterranean in us. To put it differently, metaphors help to raise questions without having to make them explicit. Think about Monto Tobatek Singh, and you'll understand what I mean. I met a couple of years ago a young French scholar working in Hong Kong, and who did his PhD on fiction and democracy in China. And he made a very interesting point, saying that, you see, what Chinese academics are not able to do for quite a number of reasons, Chinese novelists are able to do. And that's an additional correlation, of course, between what happened in the world and the various ways which could be used for conveying that to the reader. And of course, Greek literature is something which is by definition universal. Think again about Monto, Acri Salute. The last salute from Subedar Rabnawaz to his dying friend Ram Singh across the Tetwal front during the first Indo-Pak war in Kashmir. Let's forget a moment the geopolitics of partition. And we have here, in a specific South Asian context, the South Asian expression of what fighters who were friends and who are now enemies might have met in Ireland, in Koreas, in many African wars, and probably as well what they could have met during the American Secession War, not to speak about Europe, and not to speak about most civilian wars. And this brings me to a comment made recently by Nobel Prize Oran Pramuk. I think he did it in the Jaipur Festival this year.